we'll go ahead and get started with our featured artist, Kara Walker. You'll see a number of you folks have included some of her very interesting portraits as your backgrounds. It's kind of, I actually recall seeing her art at the Braun Museum in Los Angeles when you could actually visit it. It was actually in one of the rooms on the second floor. It was it's kind of very similar to cutouts. And her topics were really fairly wide ranging, but a lot of it actually related to pre-Civil War slavery. So very interesting artist. You can see in my background that the New Yorker, this is from the cover of a New Yorker magazine, the famous literary magazine. And they had asked her to do a portrait of Toni Morrison here just recently. So let's go ahead and get started. She actually, just a few more points here about her. I think she's a very interesting artist. She was actually, we're featuring her because of one of your suggestions as artists to consider. So I'm going to hand it over to Sarah.
Hi, everyone. I just want to begin by addressing a question from last week that I believe Peter had on Frida Kahlo and her relationship to magical realism. So I found an article that talks about this. And last week I mentioned she's labeled more as a surrealist. But surrealism and magical realism kind of float along the same axis, or kind of like a Venn diagram, if you will, with Frida in the middle. The article says that many of Kahlo's artwork rests in the genre of magical realism. They portray a realistic view of herself surrounded by magical elements. So kind of like the painting I showed, Henry Ford Hospital, where she's in the hospital bed, and it's her as a human, but then you've got the orchid and the snail and the fetus. So those aspects of magical realism surrounding her. So in short, yes, there are aspects of magical realism and her body of work, as well as surrealism. Okay, let's talk about
Thank you so much for tracking that down.
Of course, you're welcome.
I wish I could go out somewhere and tell somebody that so they think I was smart, but
it does sound people are like, what's magical realism? It sounds very intellectual. All right, so Kara Walker was born in Stockton, California in 1969 and lived with her father, who was also a painter and a professor. She said of her father, quote, "One of my earliest memories involves sitting on my dad's lap in his studio in the garage of our house and watching him draw. I remember thinking, I want to do that too. And I pretty much decided then and there at 2.5 or 3 that I was an artist just like Dad." Her family moved from Stockton to Atlanta when her father took a job teaching at Georgia State University, and they settled in the Atlanta suburb of Stone Mountain. This was a bit of a culture shock for Kara, going from the integrated, more liberal city of Stockton to a heavily white, more conservative neighborhood of Stone Mountain. She even recalls Stone Mountain holding Ku Klux Klan rallies and being called racial slurs at her high school. And this had a profound influence on her art that we'll look at in a second. Walker went on to receive a BFA from the Atlanta College of Art and an MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design. And although she experienced racism growing up, she was hesitant to discuss or include race in her art in her early college years. And it wasn't until she was doing her master's degree that she finally began to incorporate race into her art. And it ended up being a pinnacle for why she's such a respected artist today. As AJ mentioned, Walker is known for her panoramic silhouettes, usually made from black paper on a white background. And she uses this medium to portray American slavery and the horrific experiences of Black people in the antebellum South. Silhouettes back in the day were more of a respectable tradition in American art history, often being used for portraits and illustrations. However, Walker takes this and uses them to portray a world that reveals the brutality of American racism and inequality. So this background behind me is our first piece that we'll look at. The full name of it is called Gone, A Historical Romance of a Civil War as it Occurred Between the Dusky Thighs of One Young Negress and Her Heart. This piece was shown at Walker's first exhibit in New York in 1994. And the overall dimensions of this are 13 by 50 feet, so it's massive. I apologize if it's a little bit hard to see the details, just because it's so big and they're all in in one picture together. But if we look kind of near the weeping willow tree, we can see a well-dressed couple standing under the moonlight, signifying kind of a storybook romance. However, when we examine the rest of the image, there are more disturbing and violent scenes taking place. If we kind of move across the panoramic, we can see a small figure strangling a bird, a young girl floating away on the river, underage fellatio. You can see a woman with babies flying out from under her dress, one of which landing on its head, and even a man being carried away into the sky with an almost comically large erection. And then on the other side of the silhouette, we see a man with his head up a woman's skirt. So Walker uses this medium that used to be considered respectable as a new type of storytelling, one that confronts power and oppression. Here's actually a quote by Walker commenting on what this piece represents. "The history of America is built on this inequality, the gross, brutal manhandling of one group of people dominant with one kind of skin color and one kind of perception of themselves versus another group of people with a different kind of skin color and a different social standing. And the assumption would be that, well, times changed and we've moved on, but this is the underlying mythology and we buy into it. I mean, whiteness is just as artificial a construct as blackness is." This next one, this is titled "The End of Uncle Tom and the Grand Allegorical Tableau of Eva in Heaven." This was done a year later in 1995. And this one was actually done as a 360 cyclorama, which is why it's a little hard to capture everything in the photograph. It might look a little bit distorted. But Walker wanted to highlight the encompassing and inescapable horror of the past. That's why she did it in a 360 degrees. It's based off the book Uncle Tom's Cabin and shows many reenactments of the torture and assault of those enslaved in the American South. And finally, this third one, this is titled Darkytown Rebellion and was done in 2001. And in the 2000s, Walker began to experiment with light on her silhouettes. This was a 37-foot gallery corner at the Whitney Museum, and Walker used different colored light to project an almost psychedelic feel to her piece. This silhouette portrays a gruesome rebellion that she took inspiration from the infamous Brooks slave ship, the Birth of a Nation, and the Aunt Jemima logo, which we know has been recently retired due to its stereotypical portrayal of Black women. And with this, Walker plays with the notion of history versus modernity, kind of like what I was talking about in the first image, in that these images are of American slaves of the past, but do these images still have relevance in the 21st century? That is, something to think about, something to discuss. So Walker ended up facing controversy throughout her career for garnering success over the portrayal of these offensive Black stereotypes. But she now lives in New York City. She teaches extensively at Columbia University, and she was elected to the American Philosophical Society in 2018. So I hope that broadens your mind on modern art nowadays, and I hope it makes you think a little bit about our history versus especially what we're experiencing right now in the United States. So thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Sarah. That's very cool and interesting. Kind of the intersection of art and history in art history.
Definitely.
All right, excellent. I didn't realize she had gone to the Rhode Island School of Design. That's a very prestigious school.
Yes.
Yeah, very hard to get into. All right, excellent. Do you have any questions of Sarah?
Sarah, are you familiar with Lottie Reininger?
I'm not. I have not heard that name.
She's a German filmmaker who actually has a credit for creating the first feature-length animated film in 1926. And can you see my screen?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, this is one of her films. It's very evocative of the style, using the silhouettes in the early part of film history to create these stories. She focused a lot on German fairy tales, but I think her most famous film was one about the adventures of Prince Ahmed, which she made in 1926. Now, very similar visual style. I don't think the content could be more different, but I was just kind of curious when I started looking at this up for this meeting. Because I had one film of hers, or two actually, and I thought this is very, very similar to that kind of whimsical style, but just much different ones. Anyway, I thought it was kind of interesting that there's that parallel there.
Yeah, the resemblance, and yet they can be so different.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. German fairy tales can actually be quite gruesome and dark.
And the Middle East, the Prince Ahmed one is, it has some pretty, visually amazing things, but it's much more of a subtle level, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Is Walker still actively doing art?
Yes, I believe she is. She's switched over a little bit more to teaching, but she is still doing art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the New Yorker just recently had her do the background that I have on my Zoom tile, and that's for one of their covers. That's a portrait or silhouette of Toni Morrison. Yeah, and there's a current show, not that you can see it, but I think you see it online, of her work at the Tate. I know there's a number of pieces of the Broad Museum as well, and the Broad has put her work up online. All right. Hey, excellent. Thank you, Sarah, so much. Very, very interesting artist.
Thank you.